People are now talking about the Naira, which is alarmingly declining in value. And I think most people are not aware that Nigeria has walked this road before. So all the talk reminds me of my own research on Nigerian structural adjustment and the consequences. And I think the consequences we're feeling today are still very much repercussions from those past experiences. So what I want to do is read a little bit of my paper, State and Civil Society in Nigeria in the Era of Structural Adjustment Program, 1986 to 1993. This is drawn from my PhD research many moons ago. So I begin by quoting Senator Abraham Adesanya, who said, "I have a dream of a nation where no man is oppressed, an egalitarian society. That is what we're working towards. We desire a nation, a true federal state, where all the nationalities will have equal access to political power, where justice, equity, and the rule of law operate. We want to leave a good legacy for our children, like you said. I am old. There's nothing again that I'm looking for, but our children and children's children must not be slaves in their father's land." So the focus of this paper, which I said I wrote a long time ago, is on state-society relationship in a situation of flux that is rapidly changing, where there are fundamental questions regarding the nature of the state and the type of state that will best serve a country whose goal is economic and political development. It is also a situation where the state is stuck deep in the morass of economic and political crisis, creating even more urgency to fashioning answers to these questions. Within society, there are organizations that challenge the state and critique its responses to political and economic problems. Organizations that push for further opening of the political sphere. They are not political parties, but associations whose social and economic agenda compel them to make claims on the state. Specifically, this paper explores the dynamics of the decision by the federal military government of Nigeria at the time to adopt and implement an orthodox policy of economic reform. That was the Structural Adjustment Program, or SAP. This was done on the advice of the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the World Bank. And it was against the wishes of majority of Nigerians. The situation surrounding the decision can and has been characterized as an instance of state civil society struggle, during which the government utilized a variety of strategies, including discussion, negotiation, compensation, amelioration, co-optation, coercion, and repression. These strategies were pursued, sometimes sequentially, and at other times they were simultaneous. However, due to overwhelming public antipathy to the SAP, its implementation did not always follow a direct path, nor did it keep to the original schedules agreed upon with the multilaterals, that is the IMF and the World Bank, and Nigeria's creditors. The government's inability to maintain a strict enough agenda in its implementation of the SAP in turn elicited negative and punitive responses from the IMF, World Bank, and creditor clubs coalition. There was the Paris Club and the London Club. I'll talk about these much later. The punitive measures served to aggravate the already explosive political situation in Nigeria. Nigeria during the period from 1986 to 1993 is what I'm talking about here. This provides an interesting case study of the dialectical process in which contesting social, political, and economic forces shaped the implementation of SAP. In consequence, the domestic political economy underwent radical transformation. The question of state sovereignty is central to discussions of policymaking and implementation. Thus, what I do in this paper is to assess the extent of the power of Nigerian state over society. I also tried to evaluate state power in relation to the external actors. Mainly, the major external actors include the Paris Club and London Club and the multilateral organizations, principally the IMF and the World Bank. The perceived weakness of the African state, not just Nigeria at the time, generated a lot of contestation on the relationship between state and civil society. Some people at the time considered this relationship to be inherently conflictual. Others saw the possibility for a relationship that may be congruent as well as conflictual. Among those were Bratton. A serious examination of the Nigerian situation, I argued, revealed the resistance of a trans-class coalition of social forces united against economic and political marginalization. The interaction between state and civil society that I examined occurred in an environment where, by and large, the theoretical explorations into the nature of the state in Africa told us that there were strong societies and weak states. Overlaying the environment is what is often characterized as the Washington Consensus, which contends that it is imperative at the time, that is, for African countries to become further incorporated into the world system. And you know what? That's what is being argued today as well. This imperative generates the utilization of programs of structural adjustment, which are neoliberal policies, as the only viable option for economies in distress. And at the time, as now, you know, Nigeria was heavily indebted. The political economy of Nigeria for the past 16 years before the time I did the study, which was the 1980s to the 1990s, the political economy of Nigeria was defined by the burden of a huge external debt and two other phenomena. One is the extent to which the state either complied with or failed to respond to the adoption and implementation of SAP that were recommended by the multilateral organizations, the World Bank and the IMF. Second is the subsequent struggle between the state and significant actors in society to define the political and economic terrain. Although in scholarly literature, the African state is generally described as weak, it is also described as dominating the political, social, and economic arena because there are no countervailing forces to challenge its limited influence. In essence, civil society is weak to the point of non-existence in this kind of way of thinking. The explanation often given for this is that while the colonial era presented numerous examples of, developing or burgeoning voluntary associations, most of them became political movements in the anti-colonial struggle for independence. Upon independence, state creation and nation building were the preferred priorities. Most states, through corporatism, mass mobilization, preemptive action, and co-optation, deliberately prevented the emergence of autonomous civic associations, or they short-circuited their development. The major points I make are the following. The phenomenon observed in the period between 1983 and 1993 was an instance of a relationship between state and society, state and civil society, that is, in a period of deep economic and political crisis, where the possibility of both democracy and economic development were challenged and deeply contested. The grounds of contestation were the following. One, there was a clamorous call for democratization. And while the state insisted on a controlled transition, significant social actors called for an opening of the political arena where the following conditions would be met. One is the eradication of repression. Two is that there should be freedom of expression. Three, freedom of association. Four, academic freedom. Five, meaningful political participation. Six, political accountability. Seven, the rule of law. And eight, an end to arbitrary government. So the second main call was for measures to be taken to engender economic recovery from both, and these calls were made by both state and society. But for the state, there was an initial rejection of the neoliberal program in the form of IMF conditionalities. So in that time when there was rejection, there was a 3-year impasse. And then a regime came to power as a result of a coup. So this was the second coup in 3 years. This regime under Ibrahim Babangida said that it would guarantee the settlement of the IMF agreement once and for all. The social actors rejected a pro forma response to Nigeria's economic problems. And they said that homegrown solutions were better than externally imposed ones, and that there ought to be public debate of all possible options, including critiques of government policies where necessary, and the consideration of viable alternatives. Was this an instance of state civil society struggle? Well, this is a crucial methodological question because scholarly debates on Africa have been rightly critiqued by Mahmoud Mamdani as tending toward what he called the programmatic and ideological as opposed to historical analysis. To claim that civil society exists as a fully formed construct in Africa, as in Europe, amounts to claiming that the driving force in democratization is universally a struggle between civil society and the state. The scholarly interest in the study of civil society increased prodigiously after the Eastern European resistance movements happened in the late 1980s. And this was assumed to point towards a shift from bringing the state back in to what Michael Bratton describes as taking the state back out. The latter was an imperative that was pursued vigorously by groups undertaking what Mamdani describes as, quote, an unarmed struggle, civil struggle that seeks to create a self-limiting power, unquote, as the new model of the relationship between state and society. And this entailed also ignoring the occurrence of a previous shift in the same direction in South Africa, at least a full decade earlier. And this was in Durban in 1973 and Soweto 1976. So for a claim that state and civil society either collide or relate in other ways in Africa to be valuable and valid, one needs historical analysis instead of seeking analogies between African phenomena and those in the dim or recent past of Europe. This is not an argument that civil society cannot possibly exist in Africa, but that it may not parallel its Western counterpart in its behavior and priorities, especially historically. So there's ample evidence of the long-term existence of associational groups in Nigeria. There has also been a record of the vibrancy of such groups under situations of extreme repression and oppression, beginning from the colonial era and continuing until the very recent past. Some people would argue that the specter of repression still lurks visibly in the Nigerian body politic. During the period considered by this study, which was 1980s to 1990s, the Shagari, Buhari, Idi and Babangida regimes displayed high levels of authoritarianism. Regardless, associational groups not only existed, they thrived. Additionally, while the opening up of the political arena leads to even more efflorescence of associational groups, a narrower political arena does not necessarily lead to the group's disappearance. Instead, they may choose to pursue goals through different strategies. This could lead to such associations becoming either less or more politicized. Nigeria's associational groupings have their roots in pre-colonial organizations that were brought into the colonial cities and mining centers by rural migrants. These included ethnic mutual support and hometown associations, burial societies, informal savings clubs, dance groups, trade and associational guilds. And these groups wanted to promote and defend the interests of their members. Some of them formed the nuclei of the political associations that provided the vehicle for nationalist anti-colonial agitation. Others of them continued to serve and protect the myriad of interests of their members in many other ways. So Mamdani tells us that one avenue to genuine democracy lies in recognizing the liberatory possibilities of the rural in the urban and the concomitant possibilities of the urban in the rural, generating democratic change. So particularistic groups can engender democracy when they bring the knowledge and strategies that are gleaned from sojourn in urban areas to rural areas. New forms of knowledge can also be introduced when those who originate from and intermittently reside in the rural areas come to work or reside in urban areas. When there are divisions that forestall the development of a united front between the disenfranchised rural and urban populations, democracy is stymied. So ultimately, only a combination of the rural and urban will democratize African countries. The untold story of state civil society relations in Nigeria and most of Africa is that civil society is a restricted arena, a playing field for the privileged few. It was the same in the colonial era, and it remains the same today, although these groups are much larger in number for many different reasons that we might get into later. As expressed so concisely by Mamdani, there is a divide between citizens and subjects in Africa that was constructed during the continent's colonization, and this remains unchanging. Thus, we can say that the civil society of which I speak is not all-inclusive. It is also not necessarily internally democratic. For civil society to become meaningful as a bearer of change, those Africans who have been incorporated into the arena of state power as subjects must first become citizens. The larger implication of this is that the centralized despotism of the state as constructed during colonization must be dismantled. While then, the numerous groups, some of whom I consider here, fought valiantly against the despotic power of the state, the struggle for democracy remained limited, since the organization of power remains the same. The struggle between state and society is best observed in the process of implementing the structural adjustment program. So the next part of the paper is about implementing SAP, the tactics that were utilized by the Nigerian government. So I'm going to stop now, and part 2 is coming soon. Thank you.